Welcome to the online class lecture of Professor S.K. Paul, University Department of English, BRABU, Muzaffarpur. Dear students of PG 4th semester, American Literature Group, EC1. So, good morning first. Today I am going to deliver my lecture on themes and irony in Huckleberry Finn, a novel written by Mark Twain. Though Mark Twain wrote Adventures of Huckleberry Finn after the abolition of slavery in the United States, the novel itself is set before the Civil War, when slavery was still legal and the economic foundation of the American South. Many characters in Twain's novel are themselves white slaveholders, like Miss Watson and Granger Ford family and the Phelps family, while other characters profit indirectly from slavery as the Duke and the King do in turning. Society and hypocrisy. Huck lives in a society based on rules and traditions, many of which are both ridiculous and inhuman. At the beginning of the novel, Huck's guardian, the widow Douglas, and her sister, Miss Watson, try to civilize Huck by teaching him manners and Christian values. But Huck recognizes that these lessons take more stock in the dead than in living people, and they do little more than make him uncomfortable, bored, and ironically pointed out. Religion and superstition. There are two systems of belief represented in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn: formal religion, namely Christianity, and superstition. The educated and the civilized, like the widow Douglas and Miss Watson, practice Christianity, whereas the uneducated and poor, like Huck and Jim, have superstitions. Huck, despite or maybe because of the widow Douglas and Miss Watson's tutelage, immediately immediately has an aversion to Christianity on the grounds that it takes too much stock in him. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn belongs to the genre of Bildungsroman. That is, the novel presents a coming of age story in which the protagonist, Huck, matures as he broadens his horizons with new experiences. Huck begins the novel as an immature boy who enjoys goofing around him with his boyhood friend, Tom Sawyer, and playing tricks on others. He has a good heart but a conscience deformed by the society in which he was raised. Theme of freedom. Huck and Jim both yearn for freedom. Huck wants to be free of petty manners and societal values. He wants to be free of his abusive father, who goes so far as to literally imprison, literally imprison Huck in a cabin. Maybe more than anything, Huck wants to be free such that he can think independently and do what his heart tells him to do. Similarly, Jim wants to be free of bondage so that he can achieve achieve freedom, free of bondage, and so that he can live a life of equality. By focusing on Huck's education, Huckleberry Finn fits into the tradition of the Bildungsroman, a novel depicting an individual's maturation and development. As a poor, uneducated boy, for all intents and purposes, an orphan, Huck distrusts the morals and percepts of the society that treats him as an outcast and fails to protect him from abuse. This apprehension about society and this growing relationship with Jim lead Huck to question um, many of the teachings that he has received, especially regarding race and slavery. More than once, we see Huck choose to go to hell rather than go along with the rules and follow what he has been taught. Huck bases these decisions on his experiences, his own sense of logic, and what his developing conscience tells him. On the raft, away from civilization, Huck is especially free from society's rules, able to make his own decisions without restriction, though through a deep introspection he comes to his own conclusions, unaffected by the accepted and often hypocritical rules and values of Southern culture. um, by the novel's end, Huck has learned to read the world around him to distinguish right, wrong, menace, friend, and so on. His moral development is sharply contrasted to the character of Tom Sawyer, who is influenced by a bizarre mix of adventure novels, and Sunday school teachings, which he combines to justify his own outrageous and potentially harmful escapades. This novel has also the theme of civilized society, the vision of the hypocrisy of civilized society. When Huck plans to uh, head head west at the end of the novel in order to escape further civilizing, he is trying to avoid more than regular baths and mandatory school attendance. Throughout the novel, Twain depicts the society that surrounds Huck as little more than a collection of regarded rules and precepts that defy logic. This faulty logic appears early in the novel when the new judge in town allows Peck to keep custody of Huck. The judge privileges Pap's rights to his son as his natural father over Huck's welfare. At the same time, this decision comments on a system that puts a white man's rights to his property, his slaves, over the welfare and freedom of a black man, in implicitly comparing the plight of slaves to the plight of Huck at the hands of Pack. Twain implies there it is impossible for a society that owns slaves to be just, no matter how civilized that society believes and proclaims itself to be. Again and again, Huck encounters individuals who seem good, Sally Phelps, for example, but too Twain takes care to show our prejudiced slave owners. This shaky, this shaky sense of justice that Huck repeatedly encounters lies at the heart of society's problems. Terrible acts go unpunished, yet frivolous crimes such as drunkenly shouting insults lead to executions. Sherborne's speech to the mob that he has come to lynch him accurately summarizes the view of society Twin gives in Huckleberry Finn rather than maintain of collective welfare. Society instead is marked by cowardice, a lack of logic, and profound selfishness. Guilt or shame. Huck experiences guilt and shame at various points throughout the novel, and these feelings force him into serious questions about morality. Huck's guilt is largely tied to the religious morality he learned from Widow Douglas. Not long after he and Jim set out on their journey, Huck realizes that by helping Jim escape, he has done harm to Jim's honor. Miss Watson, he explains, he explains, conscience says to me, what did the poor old woman do to you that you could treat her so mean? I got to feeling so mean and so miserable I most wished I was dead. Chapter 16 in chapter 16. Here, here Huck recognizes that has broken the golden rule of Christianity, which states, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Huck remains conflicted until near the end of the book. The breaking point comes in chapter 31 when he finds himself unable to pray. Huck realizes that in his heart he does not believe Jim should be returned to slavery, and saying so in prayer could result in him playing double and hence lying to God, lying to God when he finally resolves to help Jim escape for the last time. Huck vanishes, the last vestiges of guilt. Element of empathy. Empathy. The theme of empathy is closely tied to the theme of guilt. Huck's feelings of empathy help his moral development by enabling him to imagine what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. The theme of empathy first arises when Huck worries about the thieves he and Jim abandon on the wrecked steamboat. Once he is escaped immediate danger, Huck grows concerned about the men. I began to think how dreadful it was, even the murderers, to be in such a fix. Huck's concern drives him to go and find help. Another significant example of empathy in the book comes in chapter 23, when Huck wakes up to Jim moaning and mourning to himself. Huck imagines that Jim is feeling low and homesick because he is thinking about his wife and children. I do believe he cared just as much for his people as white folks for their inn. It doesn't seem natural, but I reckon it's so, despite the residual racism. In this comment, Huck's capacity for empathy has a strong humanizing power. Adventure. Ironically given the book's title, the theme of adventure in the adventures of Huckleberry Finn tends to conjure a sense of immaturity and childish make believe. The book begins by pointing backward to its prequel, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and the boyish exploits that resulted in Tom and Huck striking it rich. Chapter 2 continues this type of adventure with Tom and his gang of highwaymen. The spirit of adventure as play follows Huck beyond St. Petersburg, but the real life situations Huck and Jim find themselves in frequently demonstrate that adventure is not what Tom and his games have made it out to be. The first of these situations occurs in chapter 12 and 13 when Hux gets excited about a wrecked steamboat but quickly flees upon discovering that three real murderers are hiding out there. By the end of the book, when Tom returns and tries to enforce an overly complicated and romantical plan for James' escape, the very foundations of adventure have come to strike Huck as childish and unrealistic. Even so, Huck remains some lust for adventure, which he demonstrates when he declares his intent to leave Pikesville and light out for the territory. Money and wealth. money does money does nothing but cause problems. In this book, Huck complains that ever since he came into a significant sum of money at the end of Adventures of Tom Sawyer, he has had to suffer attempts to civilize and educate him in the early chapters of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The biggest problem Huck's money brings him is his father, Pap. Pap mainly wants access to Huck's money so he can buy more alcohol, and his capacity for anger and violence becomes clear, and Huck refuses to hand over any cash. Further, money related problems arise following the initial appearance of the Duke and the Dauphin, who swindle among who swindle common townsfolk out of their money. Their scams cause anxiety for Huck and wreak havoc in all of the small towns they visit. The only time money seems like it money seems like it might have a redemptive power is at the end of the novel when Tom gives Jim $40 to pay his way back north. For Jim, money holds the promise of liberation, but given the many problems money has brought throughout the book, it seems unlikely that money alone will guarantee Jim his freedom. Childhood. Huck's youth is an important factor in his moral education over the course of the novel, for we sense that only a child is open minded enough to undergo the kind of development that Huck does. Since Huck and Tom are young, their age lends a sense of play to their actions, which excuses them in certain ways and also deepens the novel's commentary on slavery and society. Ironically, Huck often knows better than the adults around him, even though he has lacked the guidance that a proper family and community should have offered him. Twain also frequently draws links between Huck's youth and, and Jim's status as a black man. Both are vulnerable. Yet Huck, because he is white, his power over Jim. And on a different level, the silliness, pure joy, and naivety of childhood give Huckleberry Finn a sense of fun and humor, though its themes are quite weighty. The novel itself feels light in tone and is an enjoyable enjoyable read because of this rambunctious childhood excitement that enlivens the story. Huckleberry Finn is full of malicious lies and scams, many of them coming from the Duke and the Dauphin. It is clear that these con men's lies are bad, but for they hurt a number of innocent people. Yet Huck himself tells a number of lies and even cons a few people, most notably the slave hunters to whom he makes up a story about a smallpox outbreak in order to protect Jim. As Huck realizes, it seems that telling a lie can actually be a good thing depending on its purpose. This insight is part of Huck's learning process as he finds that some of the rules he has been taught contradict what seems to be right at other points. The lines between a con, legitimate entertainment, and approved social structures like religion are fine indeed. In this light, lies and cons provide an effective way for Twain to highlight the moral ambiguity that runs through the novel. Superstitions and folk beliefs. From the time Huck Huck meets him on Jackson's Island until the end of the novel, Jim spouts a wide range of superstitions and folk tales, whereas Jim initially appears foolish to believe so unwaveringly in these kinds of signs and omens. It turns out, curiously, that many of his beliefs do indeed have some basis in reality or presage events to come, much as we do. Huck at first dismiss most of Jim's superstitions as silly, but ultimately he comes to appreciate Jim's deep knowledge of the world. In this sense, Jim's superstition serves as an alter or as an alternative to accepted social teachings and assumptions and provides a reminder that mainstream conventions are not always right. Huckleberry Finn is full of people who base their lives on romantic literary models and stereotypes of various kinds. Tom Sawyer, the most obvious example, bases his life and actions on adventure novels. The deceased the deceased Emmeline Grangerford painted weeply maidens and wrote poems about dead children in the romantic style. The Shepherdson and Grangerford families kill on kill one another out of a bizarre, overexcited conception of family honor. These characters' proclivities toward the romantic allow Twain a few opportunities to indulge in some fun, and indeed the episodes that deal with the subject are among the funniest in the world. However, there is a more substantive message beneath that popular literature is highly stylized and therefore rarely reflects the reality of a society. Twain shows how a strict adherence to these romantic ideals is, is ultimately dangerous. Tom is shot, Emmeline dies, and the shepherd's sons and Granger force end up in a deadly clash. The symbol, the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River is a symbol used in this novel. For Huck and Jim, the Mississippi River is the ultimate symbol of freedom. Alone on their raft, they do not have to answer to anyone. The river carries them toward freedom for Jim, toward the free states for Huck, away from his abusive father, and the restrictive civilizing of St. Petersburg. Much like the river itself, Huck and Jim are in flux, willing to change their attitudes about each other with little prompting. Despite their freedom, however, they soon find that they are not completely free from the evils and influences of the towns on the river's banks even early on. The real world intrudes on the paradise of the raft. The river floods, bringing Huck and Jim into the contact with criminals, wrecks, and stolen goods. Then a thick fog causes them to miss the mouth of the Ohio River, which was to be their route to freedom. The plot of Huckleberry Finn tells the story of two characters' attempts to emancipate themselves. Huck desires to break free from the constraints of society, both physical and mental, while Jim is fleeing a life of literal enslavement. Much of the conflict in the novel stems from Huck's attempt to reconcile Jim's desire for emancipation with his own. Initially, Huck is only concerned with his own freedom and does question the morality of slavery. But after spending time with Jim, Huck's conscience tells him that he needs to help Jim because Jim is human being. Jim is a human being while Huck faces few legal barriers in his own quest for personal freedom. The stakes are much higher for Jim since it is against the law for slaves to run away. Over time, Huck develops an inner conviction that he can't return Jim to slavery, despite feeling guilty for acting in a way his society considers immoral. Huck decides he must treat Jim not as a slave but as a human being. Initially, Huck's conflict with society is embodied by the widow Douglas attempts to civilize Huck and thereby make him into an upstanding citizen. Being an upstanding citizen also means accepting slavery and institutionalized racism. Tom Sawyer convinces Huck to stay with the widow, telling Huck that he must stay respectable in order to remain in Tom's robbers gang. Paradoxically, Huck must play by society's rules in order to be an outlaw. Huck's drunken, abusive father poses a more direct threat to Huck's freedom when he kidnaps Huck. Huck escapes his captivity by faking his own death and running away to Jackson's Island. There he meets Jim, uh, whose status as a runaway slave marks him as an even more serious victim of social strictures. The two characters band together in an act of mutual escape, setting out on a raft down the Mississippi River. The episodes that follow bind Huck and Jim closer together, especially when Huck decides to lie about Jim having a smallpox to prevent him from being captured. As Huck comes to see Jim's humanity, he grows increasingly conflicted about the morality of being an accessory to Jim's escape. The rising action begins when Huck and Jim meet the king and duke, the newcomers claiming to be royalty who are in fact con men and who carry out despite tricks on unsuspecting townsfolk. Though witnessing the king and duke's various scams, Huck becomes aware of Jim's essential goodness in contrast to self interested hypocrisy of most of the people they meet in calling themselves royalty. The king and duke highlight the fallacy of assuming some people are superior to others by nature of their birth and makes Huck question what civilized society actually represents. All kings is mostly uh, rapscallions, as far as I can make out, he tells Jim. Huck wrestles with his own conscience and feels guilt for his role in the king and duke's deceptions, especially when they conspire to rob Peter Wilkes' daughters. He tells Mary Jane Wilkes the truth about the Duke and King, marking the beginning of his moral evolution. He acts out of compassion for Mary Jane rather than self-interest. After narrowly escaping the Wilkes, the Duke and King sell Jim, who is captured and held by Tom Sawyer's aunt and uncle. The climax of the novel comes when Huck must decide whether to reveal Jim's whereabouts, guaranteeing Jim will be returning to slavery and himself implicating himself in breaking the law by fleeing a slave. After initially deciding to turn Jim in, Huck's feels all washed clean of sin for the first time, but then remembers how kind Jim was to him and reverses his decision, vowing, vowing to help Jim escape. Tom arrives and joins Huck in devising an elaborate plan to free Jim, seeing the escape as a chance for adventure like the novels he reads rather than understanding the moral gravity of the situation. After much delay, as Tom creates unnecessary complications to heighten the drama of the escape, Tom and Huck succeed in freeing Jim, and Tom is shot in the leg in the ensuing chase. Jim insists on getting a doctor, and Tom stays on the raft while Huck goes for help and Jim hides in the woods. The doctor returns Tom and Jim to Tom's aunt and uncle, revealing that gave up his own chance at freedom to help Tom. Jim's steadfast morality and selfishness demonstrates the absurdity of a society that considers him less than human. Following the attempt to free Jim from captivity, Tom reveals that Jim had already been legally emancipated following the death of his owner, Miss Watson, and that Tom only wanted to help him escape for the fun of it, further contrasting Tom's boyish self interest with Huck's newfound adult morality. Tom pays Jim $40 to compensate him for his troubles, enabling Jim to take a steamboat back up north where he can reunite with his family and live in relative freedom. Although the fact that all the other slaves the characters meet during the adventures remain enslaved compromises Jim's victory. Jim reveals that Pep is dead, a fact he tried to protect Huck from, and the final evidence of his generous and empathetic nature. The fact that Tom kept Jim's freedom a secret has important implications for Huck's final decision to shirk civilized life for good and light for the territory ahead of the rest, by which he means he wishes to head west. Huck's continued ambivalence towards civilization suggests that even though the particular particular matter of Jim's freedom has been resolved, the greater immortality of society persists in the form of slavery and institutionalized racism. The protagonist of Twain's novel is Huckleberry Finn, who acts as the book's narrator and tells his own story from his own perspective. Huck incites the action of the novel in two ways. First, by faking his death and running away from St. Petersburg, and second, by deciding to assist Jim as he flees enslavement. In both cases, Huck focuses on escaping from a corrupt society and running toward an idea of freedom. Although Huck's actions get the narrative going, he is not the central instigator of conflict in the novel. Instead, Huck often finds himself caught up in the conflicts of others, and he uses his natural wit and charm to get himself out of dangerous situations. In his in his in this regard, Huck bears a resemblance of the heroes of the picaresque literary tradition, who have similarly roguish adventures in a society defined by corruption. As in other picaresque novels, then society is the central instigator of conflict, and Huck must struggle to retain his ideal vision of freedom in spite of the social corruption that surrounds him. Huck's um, arc, developmental arc in the novel consists of his growing moral maturity. The groundwork for Huck's moral education has already been laid before the novel begins, primarily through Widow Douglas's religious teachings, although Huck fails to uh, comprehend his guardian's lessons at the beginning of the book. Over the course of his adventures, he comes to understand and even grow past many of these lessons. Several key moments contribute to Huck's moral education. The first comes in chapter 13 when Huck seeks help for the murderous thieves on the wrecked steamboat. Here he learns a lesson in empathy worthy of the widow. I judged she would be proud of me for helping these rapscallions. Other important moments in Huck's moral development relate to Jim. In chapter 15, Huck humbles himself before Jim and apologizes. Sorry, Jim and apologizes for playing a cruel trick on him. And in chapter 31, Huck rips up the letter he writes to Miss Watson, informing her of Jim's whereabouts. In these moments, Huck begins to understand how his society dehumanizes black people. he decides to he decides to reject social customs and religious piety alike, ultimately moving beyond the, the widow's lessons and choosing damnation over bigotry. All right, then I will go to hell. All right, then I will go to hell. So, this way, my lecture is over, it is completed. Thanks, dear students, for your kind and patient hearing that you are given to my lecture all along. Okay.